Trauma, complex trauma, PTSD and complex PTSD are one of the most common and intense sources of fear. And to understand that, we'll first look at trauma. So trauma is a threat, an overwhelming threat, to a sense of survival. Now, if we identify primarily with a certain identity, such as a Christian or a Muslim, if that identity is threatened, then we feel that our sense of survival is threatened. If we identify primarily with a body, being a body, and our body is in threat of being violated or killed, again, we experience a sense of threat to our identity. So trauma is a threat to our identity that occurs when a disproportionate mass, when a larger energy is relating to a smaller energy, because the law of mass dictates that if two energies are in relationship and they collide, as they often do, that the larger energy will always dominate the smaller energy. That if a pinball collides with a bowling ball and they go in different directions, the pinball bounces off and the bowling ball continues almost undetectably altered, meaning there is a reduction in momentum in the bowling ball, but it's so small that to the naked eye, the bowling ball continues undetectably altered in its current trajectory. Now, this interaction of mass, the smaller and the larger, when there is a threat to identity, financial identity, physical identity, social identity, physical identity, when there's a threat to identity because there is a large energy that is out of attunement, meaning it's not regulating itself to adjust to us, there is a zoom-in phenomena that occurs as the bowling ball encounters the pinball. As a bowling ball of energy encounters our energy, it looks a bit like this, until we have this phenomena called flooding. And flooding occurs when you lose the perspective. You can do it in a smaller level. You know, if you have a hand out here, you say this is a hand and this is a finger and that's a wall, etc. You have perspective. You can see distinct objects in relationship to one another because they're smaller. They're far enough away that they're distinct. But as the hand moves slowly closer and closer, you lose perspective. You lose the ability to distinguish the hand from anything else. As your traumatic event, as the energy pattern that is violating your identity on some level moves closer and closer to you, it becomes all-consuming, and everything else loses perspective. Now, this is the traumatic moment. The moment when the hand covers the lens of consciousness and all we can see is the traumatic event. Now, the reason that this is the moment is because time relies on distinction. Space relies on distinction. To get a sense of perspective in space, you've got to have two objects, two moments in time. Now, at the moment that the traumatic event hits, one of the things that get shut down are language areas of the brain and time areas of the brain. So not only does the event dominate the consciousness, it dominates the consciousness so overwhelming that there is a sense of eternity, boundless terror, boundless horror, boundless fear of the unknown. And this becomes the traumatic moment. Now, once this event occurs in an environment where there is no support to de-escalate and gain perspective, in an isolated state, so we're talking about a sociopathic culture where one is alone during traumatic events and left alone to recover from them. This is overwhelming. It's too much for the individual. So what the individual does is it packages up this overwhelming experience and dissociates it. It cuts a wire to this part of the brain. It dissociates it in a frozen state. It says, we're going to take this part of consciousness, this part of sensation, we're going to put it outside the body right now because we've got to survive, because we're not receiving help. So we've now packaged up this traumatic charge of energy and we've put it out there. Now we can focus and think and detach and navigate the terrain that is the traumatic event. However, this partitioned area of the trauma, this partitioned signature of overwhelming timeless terror, remains untouched. It's part of the benefit to dissociating is that it gives us the ability not to deal with it right now. The cost of dissociating is that as the reality moves forward, meaning if you're still alive years later, as most of us are, the reality has moved forward. It is not in that moment of timeless terror. However, the energy field of the trauma has not moved forward because it is dissociated from the primary organism. It's kind of like a photograph. If you can't deal with what's going on right now and you instead take a photograph of it and store it later, and then you can look through the lens again of the camera, and life is changing. But it's not changing for the photograph. The photograph in timeless terror is frozen in time. Now, one of the things that we can all do, because we're all, of course, connected at some level with every part of ourselves, is we can all be drawn back in to the moment in time in which we were flooded with timeless terror. Everyone can do that. However, if we dissociated from that moment under the auspices of a belief that I cannot deal with this, it's too much, it's overwhelming terror, I've lost all perspective, I'm flooded, I never want to go and feel there again. Well, if we go back into that event, it's very easy to relive it, because to digest a photograph that big, it's a huge photograph. It goes beyond our perception. It's not something that's in context as a kind of long ago event. We relive it as if it was yesterday, as if it's still happening, because for that part of ourselves, it is still happening. It hasn't gotten the update that life has moved on, because we dissociated it at a point. All it got was the message that not only can I not be dealt with, but that I'm not wanted by the self. This part of me, and anything that we think, feel, say, and act upon is an identity. So when we say this part of us feels that way, as we become this part of ourselves, banished from the psyche in a culture that doesn't like dealing with this part of us, our identity in the trauma, feels unwanted, feels rejected, feels unlovable by the very evidence of the logic that says it's not being loved, so it is unlovable. So we have this dissociation from this traumatic self. Now, the things that trigger a reintegration of all of our memories are cues. For example, if a blonde-haired man raped us at 5 years old, one of the cues to remember, to reassociate with the rape incident, is long blonde hair. Or it may be a man, or it may be this certain kind of cologne, or etc. Now, what this is it's forming a sensory link between a memory and the present-day consciousness. Now, the problem, and one of the things that keeps trauma in a chronic state, the problem is that if some part of us believed that unless we could dissociate from this memory, unless we could bury this truth, we would die, we couldn't survive, then the link with the memory becomes a new trauma in the present time, meaning as our brain starts to recalibrate, to remember, put back together the events of the trauma through the link of contextual association, now there's a part of our body that's saying where you're going to end up, what will be remembered, put back together on the other side of this association, is so devastating, it will kill you. You won't survive it. And so what can you do in present time if you're around a trigger, an associative connection point with a past memory that some part of you believes you can't survive? Well, if you follow the memory strain, the body has a message and a feeling that it's going to die. You're going to lose the identity somehow. Maybe it's, I'm a cool, tough guy, and that's my identity, and I act that way, and I do this. But if I remember that I was molested at age 3, and that I was completely and utterly helpless, this cool, tough guy identity, this pattern of thinking becomes shattered, because as it floods into my memory, I can't deal with the memory. I can't deal with the clash of identities. How can I be strong and tough and yet be so overwhelmed with helplessness, with grief, with horror? And how can I look at that fact that I was completely and utterly helpless and feel proud of my toughness? I'm valuable because I'm tough. But this part of me isn't tough. Well, then there often gets directed a lot of self-hatred and disowning, where the internalized abuser now hates the part of the self that doesn't conform to the self-adopted, often adaptive coping mechanism of a new identity, often the antithesis of the old identity. Well, if the new identity rejects, hates, and fears the old identity, how does the old identity feel acceptable and lovable and get the message that it's safe? Because the new identity is a bigger you than the old identity. We grow, we expand like rings in a tree, so the present us is bigger than the old us. If the present us, as the bigger us, rejects, hates, and punishes the small us, that is the past us is already in trauma. The past us already does not know how to deal with the situation. And the message from the larger us in the present going back into the body and into the memories of the past is you're no safer here than you are back there. Because there people hated you enough to traumatize you and not to help you. And there I hated you enough to dissociate. And I still hate you enough. And I'm in a culture that doesn't welcome you home. Now, this is a devastating unfoldment of scarcity, shattered identity, pain, loneliness, grief, and together becomes an unbearable trauma. Now, in order to preempt this drama unfolding, I can, of course, push the present-day man with blonde hair away. Maybe he's an uncle of my boyfriend. Maybe he's a teacher at my school. I can have nothing to do. I can dissociate with the trigger point, with the doorway into the memory. And now I can breathe a sigh of relief because I'm not being invited to go down into that doorway, into a hell that I don't know how to get out of, into a hell that spirals down into the more I feel this, the more I hate myself, and the more I hate myself, the more I feel this. That's a hell. That's a downward spiral. So I now have to avoid being around the blonde teacher at school. Now, what if I can't avoid? What if I meet the blonde teacher in the parking lot? And I remember that the last time I spent time looking at that blonde guy, I had a fit for 3 days. Now that fit as a new trauma, as a new dread, which is expanded. Now I've got blonde men, but now I've got school, and now I've got the parking lot. Now parking lots become off limits. Now school becomes off limits. Now, if I then go to another school, let's say I transfer school to avoid the trauma of being taken down into this rabbit hole, into the terrain of the psyche that has no answer. Well, if I proceed to transfer school, what happens if I meet a long blonde-haired student at the next school? So I change class. And then there's a long-haired parent, long blonde-haired parent of the person that picks that person up. And what I want to understand and to outline is the way that the traumatic landscape grows in size and in complexity, creating a phobia of life. Because first it's this person. Then it is all blonde-haired men. Then it is this school. Then it is the parking lot. Then it is this other school. Now it is going out into the world. And pretty soon, the body starts to send a message to the consciousness that says, if you leave this door, if you go out of the house, you're going to go into this wild, chaotic place that is out of control. And somewhere along the line, you're going to be swept up into a vortex of memory. And your body is going to feel like it wants to die. And you will not know how to cope. And no one around you is going to understand how to deal with you, what's going on. No one will understand what you're feeling. And you won't have the language to tell them. And if you do tell them, they won't have the competency and compassion to listen. And if they do listen, they won't have the intelligence and empathy to understand. It's too dangerous. It's too dangerous. And life gets smaller and smaller, trying to avoid that helpless feeling at all costs. In a trauma-illiterate world, where facing that pain, that trauma, that grief is inevitable because it resides as part of ourselves in the body, in the feelings, in the memories. And because the cult and culture that produced that first wave of trauma in a way that was impersonal, meaning there was nothing wrong with that 5-year-old boy who was molested. But there were many characteristics of the culture that produced a pedophilic priest, for example. A lack of emotional literacy, high levels of chauvinism, a socioeconomic structure that is about the survival of the fittest, a winner-take-all capitalism. There were a lot of different variables that produced the phenomena of a young boy being sexually molested by an older man. The shame around homosexuality, the levels of abuse, the lack of training of parents, the materialism of the scientific paradigm, which emphasizes the outer body and what can be visibly seen rather than the scars within the psyche that are often much harder to see for a chauvinist, but that affect us deeply. All of this has to be going on, and it has nothing to do with us at some level, which means that it's still going on, which means that it may happen again to us, to our partner, to our children, which means that if we don't know how to deal with it in the past, we won't know how to deal with it in the future. And this is a crisis. For the isolated ego that is shamed for needing. In a chauvinistic culture, the individual is shamed for needing. In an isolated culture that is shamed, where the individual is shamed for needing, while simultaneously producing high levels of trauma in which every single person needs survival, security, love and belonging, self-esteem, the hierarchy of human needs, but needs support, needs love and belonging, needs trauma-literate individuals around them.